What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a simple interview, only to face a barrage of disrespectful questions that cross every line imaginable? In just 29 seconds of one particular exchange, a talk show host's career credibility would crumble right before millions of viewers as his guest refused to be disrespected any longer. The studio lights were bright that evening as Michael B. Jordan walked onto the set. The audience applauded. He smiled and waved. He wore a sharp navy suit. His energy was positive. He seemed ready for a good conversation. Bill Maher sat behind his desk with that signature smirk on his face. The kind of smirk that suggested he already had his talking points prepared. The kind that hinted he was more interested in being provocative than being genuine. They shook hands. Michael sat down. The interview began normally enough. Maher started with basic questions about Michael's latest film. Michael answered thoughtfully. He talked about the preparation for his role. He discussed working with the director. He mentioned the themes of the movie. Everything seemed fine at first. The audience was engaged. They laughed at the right moments. Michael was charming and articulate as always. But then something shifted. Maher leaned back in his chair with that look. That look that regulars of his show knew all too well. It was the look that said he was about to say something he thought was edgy, something he probably thought would make headlines. He cleared his throat, and the tone of the conversation changed instantly. "So, Michael," Maher began, his voice dripping with a false casualness that barely masked his real intentions. "I've been thinking about something. You know, you've played some pretty intense characters. Killmonger, Adonis Creed, all these strong roles. But I have to ask, and I think the audience wants to know this too. Do you ever feel like you're just filling a quota? Like Hollywood just needs their token guy for these movies?" The audience went quiet. You could hear the discomfort ripple through the crowd. A few people gasped. Michael's expression changed. His smile faded. His jaw tightened just slightly, but he maintained his composure. He took a breath. "I'm sorry, what?" Michael asked, giving Maher a chance to reconsider what he'd just said. But Maher didn't backtrack. Instead, he doubled down. He leaned forward like he was about to make some grand intellectual point. "Come on, you know what I mean. The industry has all these diversity initiatives now. And look, I'm not saying you're not talented. You clearly are. But do you ever wonder if you got certain roles because of the climate we're in rather than just pure merit?" The audacity of the question hung in the air like smoke. Michael stared at Maher for a long moment. He wasn't smiling anymore. His professionalism was being tested in real time. Everyone watching could feel the tension building. "Bill," Michael said slowly, his voice steady but firm. "I've auditioned for every role I've ever gotten. I've trained for years. I've put in the work. I've earned everything I have. So no, I don't wonder that. And frankly, I'm surprised you would even ask that question." The audience began to applaud. They were supporting Michael. They could see what was happening. They could see a host disrespecting his guest for no reason other than to be controversial. But Maher raised his hand to quiet them down. He was already preparing his next comment. Okay, I hear you," Maher said, though his tone suggested he didn't really hear anything. "But you have to admit that the standards have changed. I mean, we're in this era where everyone is so sensitive about representation, and sometimes quality suffers because people are more concerned about checking boxes than finding the best person for the job." Michael shifted in his seat. His patience was wearing thin. You could see it in his eyes. This wasn't a genuine conversation anymore. This was a host using his platform to push an agenda while disguising it as provocative dialogue. Michael had been in enough interviews to know the difference. "Bill, what you're saying right now is disrespectful," Michael stated clearly. "You're implying that actors who look like me only get opportunities because of quotas. That's not provocative. That's just ignorant. And it's insulting to every person of color who has worked hard to get where they are. Some audience members started clapping again. Others shouted words of support. The energy in the room had completely shifted. This was no longer a standard talk show interview. This had become something else entirely. This had become a moment where someone was finally pushing back against a host who had gotten too comfortable saying whatever he wanted without consequences. But Maher wasn't done. He seemed almost energized by the confrontation. Like this was exactly what he wanted. Controversy. Conflict. Something people would talk about. He leaned back again, with that smirk returning to his face. "Look, I'm just saying what everyone is thinking," Maher continued. "We're not allowed to have honest conversations anymore without people getting offended. I'm trying to have a real discussion here about merit and talent and how the industry has changed. But if you can't handle that conversation, then maybe that says something too." That was the line. That was the moment when Michael B. Jordan had heard enough. He stood up from his chair. The audience gasped. The cameras kept rolling. Maher's smirk finally started to fade as he realized this wasn't going the way he'd planned. "You know what, Bill?" Michael said, his voice calm but filled with unmistakable authority. "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to talk about a film that I'm proud of, to have a respectful conversation. But you're not interested in that. You're interested in being provocative for the sake of being provocative. You're interested in saying offensive things, and then hiding behind the excuse that you're just being honest or having a real conversation." Maher tried to interrupt. "Michael, come on, sit down. Let's just..." But Michael wasn't finished. "No, I'm not going to sit here and let you disrespect me and disrespect everyone who looks like me. You want to have honest conversations? Fine. Here's an honest conversation. What you're doing right now isn't brave. It isn't edgy. It's lazy. It's the same tired narrative that people have been using for years to undermine the accomplishments of people of color. You dress it up as intellectual discourse, but really it's just prejudice with a bigger vocabulary." The audience erupted. People were standing now. Some were cheering. Some were clapping. The atmosphere had completely transformed. What started as a typical late-night talk show had turned into a defining moment. Michael wasn't yelling. He wasn't losing control. He was simply speaking truth with clarity and dignity. Maher tried to regain control of the situation. "Michael, I think you're overreacting. This is what we do on this show. We have tough conversations. We push boundaries." Michael looked at him with an expression that mixed disappointment and resolve. "Pushing boundaries is one thing, Bill. Being disrespectful is another. And what you're doing right now is disrespectful. Not just to me, but to your audience. You think they came here tonight to watch you insult your guest? You think they tune in to see you tear people down under the guise of honest conversation?" Maher's face was reddening now. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. He wasn't used to guests who refused to play along with his provocations. His usual tactics weren't working. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. "I've interviewed hundreds of people," Maher stammered, trying to defend himself. "I ask everyone tough questions. That's my job." "Your job is to have meaningful conversations," Michael shot back. "Your job is to inform and entertain your audience, not to use your platform to push narratives that diminish other people's achievements. There's a difference between asking tough questions and making insulting insinuations. You crossed that line tonight." The producers were probably panicking backstage. This was live television. This was unscripted chaos. But it was also riveting. Millions of people watching at home were witnessing something rare. They were watching someone refuse to be bullied. They were watching someone stand up for themselves with grace and strength. Maher made one more attempt to salvage the situation. "Look, if I offended you, that wasn't my intention." "Yes, it was," Michael said simply. "That's exactly what your intention was. You wanted to be provocative. You wanted to create a moment. Well, you created one." just not the one you expected. The audience was going wild now. The energy was electric. People were on their feet. Some were recording on their phones. This was the kind of moment that would be replayed and discussed for weeks. Michael B. Jordan had not only stood his ground, he had exposed the hollowness of Maher's approach. He had shown that what often passes for edgy commentary is really just thinly veiled disrespect. Michael started walking toward the exit. The cameras followed him. Maher called out, "Michael, come on, don't leave like this." Michael stopped and turned around one last time. "Bill, I hope you take some time to think about why your guests keep getting uncomfortable on your show. I hope you ask yourself if the controversy you create is actually contributing anything meaningful to the conversation. Because from where I'm standing, it's not." And with that, Michael B. Jordan walked off the set. The audience gave him a standing ovation. People were cheering. They were clapping. They were showing their support for someone who refused to compromise his dignity for the sake of entertainment. Maher sat behind his desk, looking smaller somehow. The smirk was gone. The confidence had evaporated. He tried to make a joke to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. The damage was done. The crew scrambled to figure out what to do next. They went to a commercial break, but the moment was already out there. The moment had been captured. Social media was already exploding with reactions. People were praising Michael for standing up for himself. People were criticizing Maher for his questions. The conversation had moved beyond the studio and into the broader culture. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just that Michael walked off. People walk off interviews sometimes. What made it powerful was how he did it. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't resort to insults. He didn't stoop to Maher's level. Instead, he calmly and clearly articulated exactly what was wrong with the situation. He named the problem. He called out the behavior. He did it all while maintaining his composure and his dignity. Maher had built a career on being provocative. He prided himself on saying things that others wouldn't say. He positioned himself as someone willing to have uncomfortable conversations. But what this moment revealed was that there's a difference between uncomfortable conversations and disrespectful ones. Michael had been willing to have an uncomfortable conversation. He would have discussed difficult topics. But Maher hadn't been interested in a conversation. He'd been interested in making statements disguised as questions. The question about quotas wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was an accusation wrapped in the language of curiosity. The follow-up about sensitivity and quality wasn't an attempt to understand. It was a judgment presented as observation. Maher had wanted to make points, not to learn anything, and Michael had seen through it immediately. What resonated with many people watching was that Michael's experience wasn't unique. Countless people of color in professional settings have faced similar moments. Moments where their qualifications are questioned. Moments where their success is attributed to anything except their talent and hard work. Moments where someone in a position of power feels entitled to diminish their achievements. Michael's response gave voice to all of those experiences. Back in the studio, after the commercial break, Maher tried to continue the show. He brought out his panel of guests. He tried to move on like nothing had happened. But the energy was different. The guests seemed uncomfortable. The audience was distracted. Everyone knew what had just occurred. Everyone knew that something significant had taken place. You can't just pretend that didn't happen and expect people to forget. One of the panel guests, a comedian, tried to address it. "So, that was intense," he said carefully. Maher waved it off. "Yeah, well, some people can't handle honest dialogue." But even as he said it, you could tell he knew how it sounded. He knew how defensive he appeared. The other guests exchanged glances. They didn't agree with his characterization of events, but they were in an awkward position. They were still on his show. They still had to get through the segment. The rest of the episode limped along. The conversations felt forced. The jokes didn't land as well as they usually did. The shadow of what had happened hung over everything. Maher kept trying to project his usual confidence, but there were cracks showing. He kept making references to people being too sensitive. He kept defending his approach to interviews. But the more he defended himself, the more it became clear that he knew he'd messed up. Meanwhile, Michael B. Jordan had left the building. He'd gotten into his car and driven away. He didn't immediately post about it on social media. He didn't rush to give statements to the press. He simply left. He'd said what he needed to say in the moment. He'd stood up for himself. He didn't need to rehash it or explain it further. His actions had spoken for themselves. The beauty of Michael's response was in its simplicity. He didn't need to overcomplicate it. He didn't need to get into a shouting match. He didn't need to try to embarrass Maher beyond what Maher had already done to himself. Michael had simply identified the problem, articulated it clearly, and then removed himself from the situation. It was a masterclass in handling disrespect with dignity. What made Maher's behavior particularly egregious was the position he was in. He was the host. He had all the power in that dynamic. He controlled the questions. He controlled the flow of conversation. He controlled the audience. And he'd use that power not to elevate his guest, not to have a meaningful exchange, but to push an agenda that diminished his guest's accomplishments. That's an abuse of the platform. Good. Interviewers know how to ask difficult questions without being disrespectful. They know how to challenge their guests while still treating them with dignity. They know the difference between probing for truth and baiting for controversy. Maher had abandoned all of that in favor of cheap provocations, and it had backfired spectacularly. The incident raised larger questions too. Questions about what we accept from people in positions of influence. Questions about what passes for intellectual discourse in media. Questions about the difference between being provocative and being productive. These weren't new questions, but Michael's response had brought them into sharp focus. In the days following the interview, think pieces would be written. People would debate whether Michael had overreacted or whether his response was justified. But for anyone who watched the actual exchange, the answer was clear. Michael hadn't overreacted. If anything, he'd been remarkably restrained. He'd given Maher multiple opportunities to course correct. He'd tried to explain why the questions were problematic. Only when it became clear that Maher wasn't interested in understanding did Michael choose to leave. The incident also highlighted the emotional labor that people of color often have to perform in professional settings. Michael had to educate Maher in real time about why his questions were offensive. He had to explain concepts that should have been obvious. He had to defend his own qualifications and accomplishments. All of this while maintaining his composure and professionalism. It was exhausting just to watch. Imagine actually living through it. What Maher seemed to fundamentally misunderstand was that diversity and merit are not opposing concepts. The industry becoming more inclusive doesn't mean standards have lowered. It means that talented people who were previously overlooked are now getting opportunities. Michael B. Jordan didn't take roles away from more qualified actors. He earned those roles through his talent, his work ethic, and his ability. The suggestion otherwise was insulting and unfounded. Maher's attempt to frame his questions as just asking what everyone was thinking was also revealing. It assumed that everyone shared his perspective. It assumed that the audience was sitting there, wondering if successful actors of color had really earned their positions. But judging by the audience's reaction, that assumption was wrong. The audience wasn't thinking that, and when Maher voiced those thoughts, they didn't nod in agreement. They recoiled. The power of the moment was amplified by Michael's calm demeanor throughout. He never raised his voice. He never became aggressive. He stated facts. He expressed how he felt. He set a boundary. And when that boundary wasn't respected, he left. It was a textbook example of how to handle a situation where you're being disrespected. You don't have to match the other person's energy. You don't have to get into the mud with them. You can simply state your position and remove yourself from the situation. For young people watching, especially young people of color, this moment was instructive. It showed them that they don't have to tolerate disrespect just because someone is in a position of authority. It showed them that walking away is sometimes the most powerful response. It showed them that dignity is not negotiable, no matter what platform you're on or who you're talking to. The standing ovation Michael received from the audience was significant too. It showed that people recognize authentic dignity when they see it. It showed that audiences are tired of manufactured controversy. It showed that there's a hunger for real conversations rather than provocations disguised as discourse. The audience wasn't applauding because they were anti-free speech or anti-tough questions. They were applauding because they recognized that what had happened wasn't about free speech or tough questions. It was about basic respect. Maher's defensiveness after Michael left was also telling. A host who was genuinely interested in having honest conversations would have taken a moment to reflect. They would have considered whether their approach had been appropriate. They would have shown some humility, but Maher doubled down. He blamed Michael for being too sensitive. He portrayed himself as a victim of political correctness. He learned nothing from the exchange. This pattern is familiar. People who pride themselves on being provocative often have a blind spot. They can dish it out, but they can't take it. They can ask insulting questions, but when someone pushes back, suddenly that person is the problem. They can challenge everyone else's perspective, but their own perspective is beyond scrutiny. Maher fell into this trap completely. The incident also served as a reminder that platforms come with responsibilities. When you have a television show, when you have millions of viewers, when you have the ability to shape conversations, you have a responsibility to use that platform thoughtfully. Maher had a responsibility to his guest. He had a responsibility to his audience. He had a responsibility to contribute something meaningful to the cultural conversation. He failed on all counts. Michael, by contrast, fulfilled his responsibilities beautifully. He was prepared to be a good guest. He was ready to promote his film. He was willing to have substantive conversations. But he also knew his worth. He knew he didn't have to accept disrespect for the sake of publicity. He modeled what it looks like to value yourself, even when others don't. The fact that this happened on live television made it even more impactful. There was no editing. There was no post-production spin. Everyone saw exactly what happened in real time. They saw the questions. They saw Michael's responses. They saw the moment when he decided enough was enough. The rawness of it made it powerful. This wasn't manufactured drama. This was a genuine human moment where someone stood up for themselves. Looking at Maher's face as Michael walked away, you could see the realization dawning. This hadn't gone the way he'd expected. He'd thought he was being edgy and interesting. He'd thought he was facilitating important dialogue, but instead, he'd revealed his own biases and limitations. He'd shown that his brand of provocative interviewing was really just an excuse to say offensive things, and he'd been called out for it in front of millions of people. The beauty of Michael's exit was that it needed no explanation. Anyone watching understood exactly why he left. There was no ambiguity. Maher had crossed a line, Michael had identified it, and when Maher refused to acknowledge it, Michael left. Simple, clear, powerful. In a media landscape that often rewards bad behavior, that celebrates controversy over substance, Michael's response was refreshing. He refused to play the game. He refused to let ratings or publicity or anything else compromise his self-respect. He showed that you can be successful, you can be professional, and you can still have boundaries that you won't let anyone cross. The interview that was supposed to be a standard promotional appearance had become something much more significant. It had become a cultural moment. It had become a teaching moment. It had become a moment that would be referenced and discussed whenever people talked about standing up for yourself in professional settings. Michael hadn't set out to create that moment, but when the situation demanded it, he rose to the occasion. What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors refuses to be disrespected? What happens when someone finally says enough is enough to a host who has gotten too comfortable with his provocations? What happens when dignity meets entitlement? We all found out that night, and the answer was both powerful and inspiring. The answer was that respect is not optional. The answer was that no platform is worth compromising your self-worth. The answer was that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away.